Hey guys, Misery here, back with another CZM video, and in today's video we're going to be doing the ultimate Arabella guide. Everything you need to know about Arabella will be in this video, whether it be partners, epiphanies, whether her dupes are good or not. You shouldn't need another Arabella guide after you're done with this video. So a quick disclaimer right before getting into the video: I rank every epiphany at a certain tier, with S being highly recommended, A being strong potential, B being awkward to use, kind of like niche, C being outclassed, and F being practically useless. I want to make that clear. If you have your own opinion, that is totally fine. You're entitled to your own opinion, as I am with mine. What does Arabella do and what role does she play? So Arabella is a striker of the Instinct Affinity, and she specializes with Fracture, which is a new debuff that newly got introduced with the introduction of Season 4. Now, Arabella isn't the only one that can apply Fracture. Hilde can also apply Fracture 2, and Olga is going to be able to apply Fracture 2 once she releases. Now, your entire goal with Arabella is to apply as many Fracture stacks as you can, and then detonate them with some of her cards, such as Hollow Verdict or Sadistic. Now, some of Arabella's cards can activate Fracture for her allies, such as Hilde, so if you're running a Fracture Arrow build on Hilde, Arabella can proc those fractures. But something very important for Arabella is her Fracture Amplification. Basically, her entire kit revolves around Fracture Amplification, and you get certain buffs if you have it upon the enemy. It enables her to do a lot more damage than she could without it, and her Fracture Amplification debuff comes from her Observer card, or if you have her E2, then it automatically procs on the highest HP enemy. So ideally, if you do not have E2, you want to get Observer card in your hand on the first turn, and then use it as soon as possible so you get the Fracture Amplification, and then you can use her attack cards to get various buffs from the Fracture Amplification. Now, getting on to her first epiphany, called Scream for Me. I have the first one ranked at B. This is kind of just like, it's decent, but it's not nowhere near good as the second or fourth one. The second one is going to be really good for buffing her raw damage when you play her with Veronica, and your Arabella single target build isn't high enough in ego, so her portion of raw damage isn't low, because the second one is going to increase damage amount of attack cards of this unit by 50% for one turn. Now, that is multiplicative, and you do want additive buffs on Arabella because her Fracture scales off of morale, but the Scream for Me is still good even though it's multiplicative, because it's buffing her attack cards by 50%. Now, this third one, it has potential if you're running a debuff composition because it scales off of how many harmful effects are on the enemy, but really you aren't going to be running her in too many compositions that have a lot of debuffs, because I'm pretty sure this is each individual debuff. Like, if you have 5 fractures, I think it'll just apply 1 fracture. I think you need 5 different debuffs for this third one. And if you're running her with Hilde, Hilde can apply a few, and it just doesn't make sense because the first one applies 3 fracture to all enemies and then another 6 to the enemy with the highest HP. So there's not really a point to go this third one when the first one exists. Either way, moving on to the fourth Scream for Me, draw 2 cards of this unit. Now, this is going to be really good because it cycles her deck. It's going to make her a lot more draw friendly. Most problems DPSs have is that they're super draw negative, but Arabella can draw her own cards, whether it be through Scream for Me or her Sadistic card, which is very nice. So I have this fourth one ranked at S because it's just going to draw 2 cards of hers. And then this fifth one is also B because it's just 4 Agony and 2 Scorched Shell enemies. Now, her cards that scale off of how many harmful effects you have on the enemy, this potentially could be good for it, but you're not going to be duping Scream for Me. You're going to be duping Sadistic or Hollow Verdict. But yeah, that's the Scream for Me epiphanies ranked and what I think on them. Moving on to her Observer card, like I was saying earlier, this is her card that applies Fracture Amplification. The first 3 are just going to be B because, they're not really that good. This first one can hit a decent threshold because it's plus 30% damage amount to this unit for 1 turn for each enemy present. So if you're going up against a ton of AoE enemies, this potentially could be good. But even then, I would just go something like the fourth one, which is very good because it's plus 80% damage amount to this unit. And when allies defeat an enemy during that turn, they'll transfer the fracture of that target to a random enemy. So, you'll be able to kill those waves and those AoE enemies a lot easier if you are transferring the fracture stacks from enemy to enemy, because you're going to be proccing a bunch of fracture stacks anyway. The second Observer, like I was saying earlier, with Scream for Me, you're probably not going to be running her in a team composition that has a lot of, individual harmful effects, but this does go up to 120% if you do want to run this. I just think this fourth one is really good because it transfers the fracture from enemy to enemy when you kill them. This third one is going to cost 1, so, it's already off to a bad start. Highly wouldn't recommend it just because all of the others are 0 cost. Even though it does have lead, it's still going to be 1 cost some of the time, and I just don't think it's worth the 1 AP. I'd rather use that AP elsewhere. And then we already talked about the fourth one. It's pretty good, generally the best here in my opinion. And then this fifth Observer is going to be best in slot for ease of usage because Arabella really needs Fracture Amplification debuff to work, and if you don't draw it, you're really not going to be doing as much damage as you want to. So, you really want to be drawing Observers as soon as possible and using it ASAP, just so you get that Fracture Amplification buff. And this fifth one has Opener, so it's always going to be the first card used at the start of the battle. But yeah, those are all the epiphanies ranked for Observer's pleasure and what I think on them. Moving on to our next card called Hollow Verdict. This is going to be be one of her main DPS cards. So these last three are just going to be C tier. They're nowhere near as good as these first two. These first two are going to be really good because they're Fracture Amplification. So this first one, Fracture Amplification, activate Fracture inflicted by allies. That is all allies including Arabella. So if you're running a Hilde Fracture Arrow build with Arabella, it's going to proc Hilde's Fracture plus Arabella's, not just Hilde's. And when Olga gets released, she'll be applying Fracture too, so I guarantee that this first Hollow Verdict is going to be a safe bet for the future when Olga comes out. Even now it's good, but the problem is that it's unique. So ideally you want to get 3 of the second Hollow Verdict and then 1 of the first one. And then the second Hollow Verdict, Fracture Amplification, activate Fracture inflicted by this unit. You're going to be applying so much Fracture with Arabella that this is going to do a ton of damage. And you want to activate Fracture as many times as you possibly can with Arabella. So these first 2 are just going to be S tier and these last 3 are just going to be C tier, because both Epiphany 1 or 2 offer 2 or more AoE Fracture detonation that outweigh the other options. But yeah, that's our Hollow Verdict card and the Epiphany's ranked for it. Moving on to Sadistic Restraint, which is another DPS card of hers alongside Hollow Verdict. Now this first one is going to be A tier because the Fracture Amplification is very similar to the Hollow Verdict Fracture Amplification for the first one. Activate Fracture inflicted by allies. As I said before, you're going to be wanting to activate Fracture as many times as you possibly can. Also, this one scales off of how many harmful effects the target has, with a max of 3 times, so you'll get 3 more hits upon this card usage. This second one is going to be one of the best here because the Fracture Amplification draw 1 card of this unit. Like I was saying with the Scream for me that has to draw 2 cards of this unit, any DPS that can go draw neutral and cycle their own cards is very valuable. Otherwise, if they can't go draw neutral, you probably have to use Veronica, who can go very draw positive and draw economy. But the second one is just going to draw 1 card of this unit and is going to activate Fracture inflicted by this unit 2 times, plus it's going to hit 4 times. So the second one is very valuable and tons of opportunity here. This third and fourth one is just going to be B tier. They're not really as good as the second and fifth one. Third one, you have to defeat enemies to even get the effect, which I don't really like defeat cards because most of the time you're not going to be defeating enemies in save data content unless it's like tower, and you're not always going to be guaranteed to kill an enemy each turn, which is why I don't really like defeat cards. But this fourth one, it's 2 costs. It does have lead, so it has a chance to go down, but half of the time it's going to be 2 costs, which ideally you don't want to be spending 2 AP for 1 attack card. It does apply a decent amount of Fracture, but still I would go something like the second one just so it draw neutrals itself. The fourth one also doesn't activate Fracture, which is a huge loss. And then onto this fifth one, this one's going to activate Fracture 2 times just like the second one, then add 1 hit for each Fracture inflicted by this unit that was activated this turn, max 5 times, which you're probably easily going to be doing since Arabella activates Fracture so many times. But yeah, those are all the Epiphanies ranked for Sadistic Restraint and what I think on them. Moving on to our unique card, the Art of Unmaking. So a lot of people are recommending to remove this because it really doesn't do anything for Arabella. It doesn't give her any Fracture stacks or activates Fracture itself. And the Fracture Amplification buff 2 times base damage amount, so really yeah, it's just more damage. You can remove this if you want because it's -1 in draw economy, but if you have the draw in your team composition, then you can keep this for more damage. But me personally, I removed it in the decks that I show later on in this video. Then moving on to her ego skill, Pathetic End. So her ego skill is very similar to her unique card where it's just more damage. You're not really going to be getting too much out of this ego skill. You're just going to be getting your base damage, and then for 2 turns inflict fixed damage to the target equal to 30% of damage amount taken by all enemies, which cannot exceed 1000% of Arabella's attack per turn. So yeah, really it's just damage and fixed damage. Nothing too insane, but if you are trying to squeeze out more damage, then yeah, I would just use this. Pretty straightforward and not really much for me to go on. Moving on to the partners, starting off with Licinia, which is going to be her designated partner. So Licinia is going to be really good because first off, she's going to increase the assigned combatant's attack, but when Fracture is applied through an ability of the assigned combatant, plus 10% to the critical chance of Arabella, or the assigned user. And then when Fracture is activated through an ability of the assigned user, inflict 1 Verjutoxin on the target. And a Verjutoxin is going to increase damage amount taken from the assigned combatant by 4% with a max of 4 stacks. This is the same multiplier as Vulnerable, which is the best debuff in the game, so this is very valuable. Surprisingly, it's actually more of a damage increase to get dupes on Licinia than Arabella herself, because Arabella's dupes are kind of mid and they're not really that good. And then as for the ego skill for Licinia, you're going to get 1 AP, which is going to be very nice for setup turn. So if you use this turn 1, that AP is going to be really nice, especially if you have a lot of upgrades that cost AP and you need to get those out the way. Then it's going to apply 3 Paralytic Poison to all enemies, which is a new debuff from Licinia, which Paralytic Poison does when attacked by a card of the assigned combat 1 Fracture. At the end of the turn, decrease Paralytic Poison by 1. So this 3 Paralytic Poison is for 3 turns. Pretty long debuff, and it's going to apply more Fracture so we can get more detonations off. Now, if you can't get Licinia, you can either go 5-star Scarlet or 4-star Lillian. Scarlet is going to work on Arabella because Scarlet just increases the damage amount of the assigned combat. There's not really any harsh prerequisites that you need for Scarlet. If the assigned combat card was used before, plus 15% damage amount to the attack cards, can stack up to 2 times and is removed when a different combatant's card is used. And then you'll also gain focus each time 2 of the assigned combatant's cards are used, which focus increase damage amount of the assigned combatant's attack cards by 20% multiplicative. So if you do not want to get Licinia, you can go Scarlet, or if you don't have Scarlet, you can go 4-star Lillian, because what Lillian does is she's going to buff the damage amount to 1 cost or lower attack cards. And Hollow Verdict and Sadistic Restraint are 1 cost or lower if you have reduced cost divine on them. And then she'll further buff attack card damage if you use skill cards. So yeah, Licinia, Scarlet, or Lillian I recommend for Arabella. Moving on to the potentials for Arabella, starting off with the first 2 major nodes. These are just going going to be buffing the basic cards. This first one, it gives Diagonal Slash, 1 Fracture. The second one is going to give plus 5% damage amount to Diagonal Slash. And if Arabella's attack is 500 or higher, add an additional plus 5% to the modifier, so that's up to plus 10% for Diagonal Slash. But the actual important one is the third major node, the unique one. If Arabella's attack is 600 or higher, plus 5% instinct attribute damage amount, and for every 20 attack exceeding 600, add an additional plus 2% to the modifier with a plus 10% max. So you're going to need 700 attack on Arabella to get the full amount here. But the other potentials that are worth mentioning are the crit chance and crit damage ones. I very highly recommend to max both of these out because, fracture scales off of crits. Fractures can crit, so more crit chance and crit damage is going to be more fracture damage. But yeah, mainly just go for crit chance, crit damage, and the last unique node that gives instinct percent damage. And those are the potentials. Now moving on to the first deck we have for Arabella. So we have Scream for Me on the draw 2 cards Epiphany. That's going to be really nice. That goes +1 in draw economy, and it's going to fish out those Sadistic Restraints, which can further also draw cards because we have that on the Epiphany that draws 1 card of this unit with the Fracture Amplification. As for the Hollow Verdict, we're just going to go with the one that activates Fracture inflicted by allies because that's going to activate Arabella's but also Hilde's and potentially Olga's fractures too. And then Observer's Pleasure, we got the 80% damage amount one that transfers fracture from enemy to enemy upon death, because that plus 80% damage amount basically acts as full morale, and fracture actually scales off of morale, which is very nice. So ideally want to be stacking as many additive buffs such as morale or is 80% damage buff from this Observer's Pleasure. And then we also have a desire card in this deck which is Sever Ties level 3 claim, because at level 3 claim, when a harmful effect is applied to the enemy, you'll gain 2 morale for 1 turn 2 times per turn, so that's up to 4 morale for 1 turn. And as I said before, Arabella really wants additive buffs. And then at level 5 claim, it'll increase DOT amount by 35%, which Arabella scales off of a DOT. And then if you really want to go all in on claim, at level 7 claim, at the start of the battle, you get 9 claim desire, and then when a claim card is used, you'll gain 1 claim desire for each stack. So if you have a level 3 Sever Ties, you'll get 3 claim desire stacks. And then once those reach 10, it'll create Desire Manifestation Claim, which is an attack card that gives 5 morale for 1 turn. So even more morale for Arabella and potentially Hilde, because Hilde also wants morale too. But yeah, that's the first deck that I recommend for Arabella. Moving on to the second deck, we just have this 4 Hollow Verdict deck. The Scream for Me and the Observer's Pleasure is the same with the Sadistic Restraint. Only difference here is that we went 4 Hollow Verdict instead of 4 Sadistic Restraint. And we actually split the Epiphanies on Hollow Verdict. So we went 3 Hollow Verdict with the Fracture Amplification of activate fracture inflicted by this unit, but then we split the 4th one for the unique one, which is going to activate fracture inflicted by allies. So if you're running her with Hilde Fracture build, that's going to activate Hilde's and Arabella's fractures. But potentially in the future when Olga releases, it'll activate Olga's too. And then Sever Ties level 3 claim, same as the other deck. But yeah, those are the 2 decks that I recommended for Arabella. As for the weapon gear slot, the weapons that I recommend for Arabella are going to be Criticism of Discord, Tentacles of Chaos, or Dagger that Trick the Shadow. Criticism of Discord is going to give 18% attack, and Arabella wants as much attack as she can possibly get, which is very nice. Same with Tentacles of Chaos, that's going to be 8% ally attack, but that also includes Arabella. Arabella is going to count as an ally, so that's 8%. It's not as good as Criticism of Discord. If you potentially can get Tentacles, that would be a solid option too. Otherwise, if you can't get either of those, Dagger that Trick the Shadow from Swamp of Judgment is going to be a good option too, because that's 12% critical damage. Now, if you really want, you can go RFS 17 if you have reduced cost divine on your your cards, making them 0 cost. It's going to give 10% critical chance of attack cards with cost of 0. But yeah, RFS 17 is just an honorable mention if you can't get any of the others, and you got reduced cost divines on your attack cards. As for the armor gear slot, starting off with this first one, it's going to be Fairy King's Crown, generally the best armor chest piece in the game for DPSs, since it gives 6% critical chance. None of the others really come close to that. If you can't get Fairy King's Crown, you can go Chidden Shield, which is going to give 3 counterattack, and on counterattack 1 shockwave to the target 1 time per turn. So this is going to give some extra damage since it's counterattack. Arabella's going to counterattack. Not as good as Fairy King's Crown, but if you can't get Crown, you can just go Chidden Shield. Otherwise, for the third armor slot, you can either just go Reinforced Combat Suit or Assault Boots, which both are just going to give shield. The Combat Suit is going to give shield at the end of the turn if you have no shield, and then the Assault Boost is just going to give shield at the start of the second turn. So you can go either of those for survivability, and if you can't get Fairy King's Crown or Chidden Shield. As for the accessory gear slot, starting off, I recommend Verdant Shackles. It's going to give 12% attack and 12% defense. Like I said earlier, Arabella wants as much attack as she possibly can get. If you can't get Verdant Shackles, you can try to get Verdant Day from, just the regular normal encounter, not the rare one. This one's going to give 8% attack and plus 12% defense. The reason we go Verdant Day and not Verdant Night is because turns 1, 3, and 5 are more important than 2, 4, and 6. People do OTK stuff on turn 1, and tower OTKs are on turn 5, so turns 1, 3, and 5 are more important. But if you can't get either of the verdicts, you can farm on the Seasonal Chaos and try to get Pulsating Egg, which is going to give plus 15% attack and 10% max HP. Otherwise, if you can't get any 3 of those, you can just go Amorphous Cube from the shop, which is going to give plus 25% damage amount. But yeah, those are all the gears that I recommend to look out for when you're farming your decks in Chaos. Then moving on to the memory fragments, I recommend 4-2 or 2-2. Now, 4-2, you're going to want to be going the 4-piece Sanguine Thorn set with the 2-piece Executioner's Tool set. Otherwise, if you do not want to go 4-2, you can just go 2-2, 2-piece Blackwing set and 2-piece Executioner's Tool set. I have heard they are pretty similar in damage output. I think the 4-2 is like 4% better or somewhere around there. So, it's not too much of a difference. Just go with whatever set has better positive rolls. Now, something I need to correct that has been going on in the community right now, a lot of people think elemental percentage does not affect fracture. It actually does. So you may have heard other content creators say that instinct percentage does not affect fracture when it actually does. Now, it may have been bugged for the first few days, which is why they thought that, but it actually does affect fracture. So fourth main stat is going to be crit chance, fifth main stat is either going to be elemental percentage or attack percentage, and then a sixth main stat is also going to be attack percentage. As for the substats, you want damage over time, crit chance, crit damage, and attack. Now, damage over time is going to be the best one here because it's a guaranteed upgrade. Crit chance and crit damage, obviously, as we know, is very RNG dependent, so you're not always going to be getting value out of your crit chance and crit damage if you don't crit. It's just like extra damage for extra damage units like Hilde. Extra damage for Hilde is on the top above crit chance and crit damage. But yeah, those are the memory fragment sets, the main stats, and the substats that I recommend for Arabella. Now, moving on to the ego manifestations, starting off with E1 for Arabella, this is just going to affect her unique card, the Art Of Unmaking. It's just going to give more damage amount to the card, and buffing how much it scales with each type of harmful effect. Nothing too insane, and you actually might be removing this card from your decks, so I wouldn't worry about the E1 too much. Now, her E2 is very nice for sorority because at the start of the battle, inflict 1 fracture amplification on the enemy with the highest health, and you're not always starting with observer and sorority with Arabella, which is a huge problem. So like at E0, Arabella is very inconsistent for sorority since you have no way to guarantee that fracture amplification. And then when Arabella activates fractures that she inflicted through an ability, she inflicts 3 fracture on all enemies 4 times per turn. So that is an extra 12 fracture per enemy. So if there's 5 enemies, that's 60 extra fracture stacks that you're getting from this E2, which is pretty nice. But I've heard from a lot of people who do math in the calculations that E0 to E6 Arabella is a 12% damage increase for her raw damage, not including her fractures. So just basing her dupes off of that alone, most of these dupes are going to be buffing her fracture. Then moving on to her E3, just like any other E3 for any other unit, it's going to buff the ego skill. Not really much to say here because this ego skill is just damage. So it doesn't really do anything special. It's just more damage for her ego skill. And then moving on to her E4, each time Arabella inflicts or activates her fracture through an ability, you'll gain 1 deconstruction analysis. And deconstruction analysis increases damage amount of Arabella's fracture by 5% with a max of 6 stacks. So that's increasing Arabella's fracture damage amount by 30% if you have this at max stacks, which is somewhat decent but not anything insane. And then moving on to the E6 because we skipped the E5 because it's just throwaway. So her E6, when Arabella activates fractures that she inflicted through an ability, additionally inflict 1 fracture on the target inflicted with fracture amplification. And then it'll increase the max stack limit of deconstruction analysis by 4, which is her E4 stacks, and plus 50% critical damage to the fractures that Arabella inflicts on the fracture amplification target. So this E6 is basically just applying 1 more fracture each time you apply fracture, and then it's going to increase the deconstruction analysis by 4, so it's 10 stacks now, which is a 50% damage amount buff to her fractures. And then lastly, she'll be getting plus 50% critical damage to the fractures that Arabella inflicts on the fracture amplification target. So yeah, her E6 sounds good, but it's not anything insane. Like when I read Hilde's E6, I thought that was like a lot more valuable and busted than Arabella's E6. But yeah, what I recommend for Arabella, just stop at E0, or if you want to use her for sorority, you can go E2, but I really wouldn't recommend going past E2 unless you're a whale, or Arabella is your favorite unit in the game. She'll do just fine at E0, but yeah, I took her to E2 me personally just for sorority, and I am trying to push Great Rift. Those are all of her ego manifestations and what I think on them. And moving on to the recommended team compositions and the teammates that I recommend to use with Arabella. Now, there's a lot you can use. You can either go AP gen, you can go draw support, or you can go morale bots. Or ideally, the most important teammates that you're going to be wanting to use with the Arabella is going to be fracture units, such as Hilde and Olga. But Olga isn't out yet, so we'll have to wait to see for her. But she's going to be able to apply fracture anyway, so they're practically made for each other. They're all instinct, and they're all the season 4 units. But yeah, you might need an AP gen on your team if you don't have cost reduction divines. You can use Typhara, Adelheid, Mika. They all provide AP, and then some of them provide buffs. Like I was saying earlier, fracture does scale off of morale. Arabella wants as many additive buffs as she can possibly get. So morale bots such as Haru, Cassius, Ray, or Beryl all work perfectly fine. And if you don't have any of those built, or you don't want to run any of them, you can just go draw support such as Veronica or Hilde. Specifically for the rift that is going on right now, I just used Arabella, Hilde, and Adelheid. But I see a lot of people going Arabella, Hilde, and Typhara. But that's specifically just for rift. It can work and save data content, but there might be better options than that. But yeah, those are the team compositions and the teammates that I recommended for Arabella. And yeah, that's going to be the end of this video. I hope this video was informative. If it was, I'd very much appreciate it if you could show support to the channel, whether it be like, comment, subscribe. It all means a ton to me. It takes me a long time to edit these guides, and I put a lot of effort into these videos, so it would make me happy if you guys could show support. Let me know what your guys' thoughts on Arabella is so far, whether if you're enjoying her, if you're disappointed. I know a lot of people are new posting her because she's not power creep. She is still a good unit nonetheless, but she's not like anything game breaking, which is why I think a lot of people are like disappointed with her. But yeah, that's gonna be the end of this video. I hope you guys take care, peace, and be safe until the next one.